Irish Nation, welcome back. We are finally ready to talk about college football. We are 9 days from the opener at Kyle Allen Field in College Station, Texas, where Notre Dame kicks off their season against the Texas A&M Aggies. My name's Brett. Welcome to the show. My co-host Mike. Excited here to dive in for a game preview in week 1 of the 24 campaign.
Feels great to finally be doing an episode where we're covering an opponent. We dove deep into our season preview, and that was a lot of fun, but there's really nothing that you can do to replicate the feeling that you have going into a game week. And the fact that we're finally here, it just feels incredible. It's one of my favorite times of the year, and ecstatic to be back and finally ramped up into the thick of everything.
So we're about to talk about Texas A&M. I also have the power of the soundboard. Texas A&M's head coach is Mike Elko, but Mike, we wouldn't know Mike Elko as Notre Dame fans, but for
Brian Van Gorder's defense has played brilliantly tonight.
So
now,
Brian,
now I know why. I mean, that was a great clip to have, but now I know what jogged. I know what prompted you to get that for this episode. I think you're like, oh, how perfect would it be when we're talking about
That's
Elko?
Great, right? So Mike Elko replaced the terrible Brian Van Gorder years. He came in as our defensive coordinator in 2017, just for 1 year, then goes to Texas A&M as the defensive coordinator, then is head coach for the Duke Blue Devils, and was the head coach for Riley Leonard, our current quarterback. He's now back at Texas A&M, replacing Jimbo Fisher, who struggled 5-7 2 years ago, was on the hot seat all of last year, went 7-6 a year ago. So Texas A&M reeling. We previewed it a little bit in the show before where we were going through the season. But Mike, we said this is the toughest game on our schedule when we walked through all 12 of Notre Dame's games this year. Why is that? What's the narrative going around Texas A&M? Why is this just such a big week 1 marquee matchup for the Irish?
So the first thing that you're going to see on the internet is that it's going to be a very hot, intimidating atmosphere at Kyle Field. Kyle Field is well known as one of the most intimidating atmospheres in the entire country. And at this point of the year, expect temperatures to be close to 100 degrees. So if you're not used to that, it definitely takes some prep. I have full confidence that the staff is going to be able to have the team ready to go, that we're not going to get dehydrated or anything like that. But it is a different environment that we're not necessarily used to handling. So I think you start there. I think you already touched on this with Mike Elko as well. He's not I guess it's unfortunately that we don't have a clip where we have an announcer talking about how great Mike Elko is as a coach, because he actually was a great coach.
Phenomenal.
And so I think we're both optimistic about how Elko is going to do at A&M. Texas A&M has, in recent memory, been a chronic underperformer. They've had a lot of talent. Jimbo Fisher was not able to quite get them to the level that they were hoping for, and it seemed like they were regressing in the later years of his tenure there. Elko is a guy, for me personally, I know you feel the same way, who I think that he'll finally be able to get them on track. Now, the question is he going to be able to do that by the first game of the season? And that might be a tall order. So I think anytime a new coaching staff is coming in, there's quite a bit of change to process. And the team is generally going to look a lot better by the end of the season than they do at the beginning. So I think that's an element that's going on here. And then on top of that, they've had a ton of transfer portal turnover. So you combine that, and I would say if he had Texas A&M looking like a well-oiled machine by that first game, I would be extremely impressed. I think doing that for any coach, I think, is going to be really tough. And I think Mike Elko is a great coach. So, but I don't know that he's going to be quite at that level to where he'll have them humming by week 1. And then I think the other element here is, I mentioned the transfer portal, but that aside, they've had a lot of turnover, but it still is, it's a talented roster. Although interestingly, actually not, per the 24/7 talent composite, not actually that much more talented than Notre Dame. So I think last year, Texas A&M, they were number 4. They've slipped a little bit. They're number 7. And you compare that to Notre Dame this year, we're actually number 10. So from an on-paper standpoint, in terms of talent, we're actually not that different. But they are very talented. They're one of the more talented teams in the SEC. So expect to see 5 stars littered at various position groups. And then I think the other big takeaway that you're going to hear from pundits online is Texas A&M defensive line. So that's their big strength. That's where they're just loaded with top prospects. They've recruited it extremely well. And then unfortunately, that's going against our biggest position group of concern, which is the offensive line. So going into the game, that's the biggest mismatch potentially. And from my perspective, we're going to go into detail more on this matchup and on key themes. But from my perspective, if you want to start, those are the key elements that you're seeing floating out there online, in the media in terms of what to think about when you're, approaching this game.
I think you covered it really well. I think if anyone stopped listening to the show after this, that's a great 5-minute synopsis of this matchup. I'm just gonna, start kind of double clicking on some other topics that you've brought up that we've written down here as we were prepping for this game. You obviously mentioned Mike Elko as the overall head coach here, comes in with a defensive minded background. Interestingly, went out of his comfort zone and brought in Colin Klein as offensive coordinator. Colin Klein, a very hot name out there in the head coaching world, had some looks to be a head coach. He's the offensive coordinator at his alma mater, Kansas State. He comes over to Texas A&M as offensive coordinator. And some Notre Dame fans might remember him. He was a very critical, could have been narrative for Notre Dame football. He was number 3 in the 2012 Heisman voting. Number 2 was Manti Te'o. And if everyone remembers, the only game that Kansas State squad lost in the regular season was to Baylor in a big blood. I think it was something like 52-24. Lost to Baylor in November. It was the second to the last game of the season, and they were ranked number 1 at the time. We were ranked number 2, or I think maybe number 3. So that was the game that, yes, catapulted Notre Dame up the board, of course, but it was also who could have been our matchup because Alabama had lost the game. So if Kansas State doesn't blow that game as, really one of the best teams in the country, Notre Dame's playing Kansas State, not Alabama. You could very easily conclude, there might be a banner at Notre Dame Stadium for the 2012 title, but for Colin Klein, stumbling to Baylor late in the season. So some interesting narratives there. And I think he's a really great coach. He's 34 years old. He's young, a smart mind. He's coached up. Will Howard is the QB he's most known for. He's run a lot of kind of mobile, dual threat quarterbacks. He doesn't have that in Connor Wegman. So that is not going to be kind of the Texas A&M playbook. We mentioned this in the last show. Wegman, very talented QB, might scramble a few times a game, but he's not going to go try to run for 100 yards a game. And so Colin Klein is going to have to mold to this offense, probably run a system he hasn't run before. I think that favors Notre Dame. If you got a 34-year-old offensive coordinator coming into a new system, new players, and trying to implement a system that coach hasn't coached before, trying to lean into strengths that coach hasn't leaned into before, I think that's going to take time for that offense to gel. And Al Golden is as sharp as it gets. Our defense, one of the toughest matchups that A&M is going to see all year. I think it's a really, really big challenge for Colin Klein in his first game in College Station. I think that one's a big advantage for Notre Dame. But don't count out Colin Klein. I think he's a big up-and-coming coach and has a lot of talent around him. I mentioned Will Howard. He was right behind Riley Leonard in one of the most coveted transfers in the class and is now QB1 at potentially the number 1 school in the country this year, Ohio State, leading the Buckeyes. So Colin Klein's done a phenomenal job in Kansas State, bringing over that experience to Texas A&M is definitely a great hire, I think, from Mike Elko. Just don't know if it's going to show up in game 1.
Totally agree. And then I think double clicking, onto some of these other topics that we were mentioning, I think another key one here is just the transfer portal. So we've hinted at that already. And for Texas A&M, it was a net loss for them. So in our season preview, we talked about a few teams that had a lot of turnover. We talked about how Notre Dame was able to, I think, have a pretty big net positive through the portal. For Texas A&M, I don't think that's been the case. They've had some transfers in. One is Nick Scorton from Purdue. But Evan Stewart and Walter Nolan are huge losses. Walter Nolan was the number 1 recruit overall a couple of years ago. Actually went to my high school for a year. Interestingly, a theme with Walter is that he has transferred schools quite a bit. So he was at my high school, but it was only for a year. And not to go on too long of a tangent here, but I would say my high school is not necessarily a football powerhouse. So I think he quickly realized that, and then he was like, yeah, he's like, all right, I gotta get somewhere else where people are gonna, I'll be able to get more exposure. But he's such a good football player that he got exposure no matter what. So those are some big losses, and they lost a ton of depth pieces. Lost guys to Alabama, UNC, Syracuse, Kentucky, Oregon, Ole Miss. And then some big time programs. So their guys, the theme here is their guys were going to big time programs. They were highly ranked recruits, and then the guys that they tended to gain to come in to replace these losses tended to come from places like Fresno State and Kansas. Not to say that you can't get great players from those programs. It's just, I think ideally you'd like to be getting more of those guys from Alabama and then having the guys that are leaving go to G5 programs. Just from an overall talent level, I think that tends to work out. More times than not. And then I think a theme here when you're looking at these losses is that depth could potentially be an issue as you get over the course of a 12-game season. So for game one, when you don't have as many injuries, and Texas A&M has had a couple injuries, but it doesn't seem like they've had a ton. But as they start to stack up over the course of the season, that's, I think, when you'll start to see this have an impact. That's when you start to see that drop off from the next man in. But for week one against Notre Dame, I don't think we're going to see that impact yet. It'll just be something to watch as the season progresses.
Yeah, I'm looking at their depth chart. 7 of their backups on defense are transfers, 4 of their starters. So their top 22 guys on defense, 11 are transfers. And as you start going down that list of transfers, it's a lot of guys that are from the group of 5, not the power 5, that, are kind of finding a home at the spur of the moment. Another way I'd put that too, they're going to have a starting right tackle in Reed Adams, who I believe is a Fresno State transfer. A Kansas transfer. I believe they've got another starter. Maybe it's a tight end that's coming in from Fresno State. So it's not like they're bringing in transfers from Alabama, right? Like they're bringing in guys to fill holes from Kansas, from Fresno State. No knocks to those schools, but just doesn't seem like it's that same level they're replacing. What to expect on offense? Gonna double click into this here a little bit. Connor Wegman's the guy for Texas A&M. 5-star recruit, number 22 overall. Some reports hyping him up as a potential top NFL prospect. He was hurt for most of last year. Through 4 games, he had thrown for over 800 yards, largely against suboptimal competition, a pretty bad Miami team. University of Louisiana Monroe. I think the third team was New Mexico.
Yep.
Prior year, he took over the starting job as a true freshman in November, played really well in the last 5-6 games for Jimbo Fisher, kind of sort of saved Jimbo's job 2 years ago. So inconsistent. He's kind of started about a season, but split over the last 2 years. Coming in as a redshirt freshman, he saved the eligibility with the injuries from last year with the medical redshirt. And so, definitely who they're leaning on to be the guy, surrounding him with really a stable of running backs. They're leading all freshman SEC running back from a year ago, Reuben Owens. He's out for the year, suffered an injury in training camp, but pretty deep at that position. I wouldn't say there's any marquee, bell cow coming in there, but Amari Daniels, Le'Veon Moss, they both had around 500 yards rushing. Same thing at wide receiver. A lot of hype around Moose Muhammad. A lot of hype around Noah Thomas. Both those guys had between 300 and 400 receiving yards a year ago. So sounds a lot like Notre Dame's wide receiver room. Maybe not a bona fide number one. That guy was supposed to be Evan Stewart. He's transferred out. Going to go play at Oregon. But I think that's kind of similar to Notre Dame, where a lot of guys stepping up, the next version of Audric Estime, the next version of, who's going to fill the room? Like, we don't really have a number one wide receiver, but we have a bunch of number 2s. And then they feel really good about their quarterback, Connor Wegman. And an offensive line like Notre Dame's, ton of just uncertainty. They brought back 3 starters from a year ago. It sounds like 2 of those guys has lost their job. So they'll actually only be returning 1 starter in a starting role. And then, as I mentioned, filling that in with either underclassmen stepping up, or I mentioned Reed Adams, who comes in from Kansas. And man, I'm going to have another Malort shot. Colinu Fau. Sorry if I got that wrong.
I think you probably did. I honestly do. Do we even need to check? I think
I
it's probably like a 98% chance that you didn't get that right.
No, for sure. You just don't say these names. That's my problem, is I actually attempt them, but he transfers in from Utah. So my assessment of this Texas A&M offense is honestly a lot like Notre Dame. New coordinator, QB that's got an injury history, but when healthy, really productive, question marks on the line, and should have good skill players, but not a lot of returning production. And where that leads me to is just a lot of question marks on that side of the ball, probably even more so than Notre Dame's, even more so than Mike Denbrock's more proven than Colin Klein, Riley Leonard more proven than Connor Wegman, Jeremiah Love, I think Mitch Evans more proven than who they have coming back. And we'll see, but I think that's edge Notre Dame. Just going to come down to, the defensive side of the ball. So I don't know if you want to click into that, Mike, on who they've got coming back, who they're losing, and what to expect on that side.
For sure. And totally agree with your assessment on the Texas A&M offense. I think this is a good matchup for the Notre Dame defense. Interestingly, SP Plus pegs A&M's offense is the better unit, which I disagree with. And I'm about to jump into the defense right here to get into why.
That is interesting.
Because I think there's a lot of uncertainty here. And sure, maybe some of these, maybe they have, from a recruiting standpoint, maybe some of these guys have some promise. But I think overall, when I just look at what Texas A&M has on defense, to me, that seems like the unit that's going to be giving us trouble. So jumping into that, I think this defense looks loaded. So they certainly lost some pretty key talent last year. Edgerrin Cooper was drafted in the second round by the Packers. And then we mentioned Walter Nolan, who was the number one recruit in his class. And he's at Ole Miss now and is expected to be one of the best defensive players in the entire country this year. So those are two big losses, no question about it. But they brought in Nick Scorton, who I mentioned earlier from Purdue. He led the Big Ten in sacks. So you're immediately replacing a key loss on the defensive line with someone who is one of the better players in the Big Ten. And then this defense is just generally littered with 4 and 5 stars. Torian York, he's expected to be a lead at middle linebacker. Albert Regis, Shamar Turner, Shamar Stewart. These guys all round out that defensive line unit that's supposed to be one of the best defensive lines in the entire country. I'm listing a bunch of names here, but the point is all these guys are really good. They're very solid. And especially for Notre Dame, that's breaking in a new offensive line, one that's very inexperienced, that's had some turnover. I think it's going to be a big challenge. And I think, again, I just go back to that SP Plus takeaway. And that's a theme that we had mentioned when we were doing our season preview, is that it just gets really hard to project nowadays with the transfer portal and everything. So you have to, you certainly do look at the data, but I think this is a great example where you also just look into the camp narratives. You look at what the beat reporters are saying, and that could give you some takeaways that doesn't match up exactly with the data. And I think that's exactly what's going on here with the defense. I think that this is, we'll see. I think this will be a good test for a good early test for Mike Denbrock. And I think if he's able to mitigate some of our weaknesses effectively through play calling and, certain formations and things like that, I think that'll be a really good sign. And then of course, if our receivers are able to get some separation, if Riley Leonard is able to not get flustered under this road environment and look accurate as a passer, I think for me, I will be feeling really good about our offense moving forward.
I think one of the things that didn't stand out to me, so everyone who's been listening to the show knows I'm a huge Green Bay Packer fan. I got more excited about our second round draft pick, Edgerrin Cooper, the more I did this preview on what they're losing. Edgerrin Cooper last year from the linebacker spot was not only their leading tackler, but had 10 sacks. I mean, he was a menace in the backfield. On top of that, out of their defensive line, Walter Nolan, we mentioned he's left. He was second on the team in sacks. With 7, tied for 4th on the team in sacks was McKinley Jackson. He's gone. And Fadil Diggs, I believe he's also gone. So the one big question I have is they have a lot coming back, but Walter Nolan and Edgerrin Cooper were studs. And some of the other guys that they had getting after the quarterback, I know they're bringing in the Purdue transfer, Nick Scorton. led the Big Ten in sacks a year ago. I know they're bringing back Shamar Turner and Torian York and all the guys you listed that I think should still be a formidable front seven. It's just a question of who's going to step up to really fill, their two best defenders. They've got to replace. What does that look like? But I completely agree. Very solid on defense. Feels like a very loaded front seven. And where they maybe have weaknesses at cornerback, I don't think we have the wide receivers to take advantage. I don't think we have the guys that are going to blow the doors off of their secondary, where I think they might have some vulnerability. That brings me to the last topic we wanted to hit on before we get into game predictions. I think this is a really interesting matchup and litmus test for both of these teams. And it could go a bunch of different ways. I think our offensive line is our biggest question mark. I think their defensive line is arguably their biggest strength, and vice versa. I think our defensive line is one of our strongest units, and their offensive line, I think, is pretty clearly their biggest question mark. Our secondary, huge strength with Ben Morrison and Xavier Watts. I don't know if their wide receivers can beat us. Their secondary, probably a weakness. I also don't think our wide receivers can beat us. And so I think there's some, strengths on weaknesses here, weaknesses on strengths. This isn't like we've got the greatest passing attack of all time going up against the greatest secondary, the greatest run defense, trying to stop Audric Estime. I think this is going to be a strength on weakness, weakness on strength that makes me feel like this could be a low-scoring game. I'm kind of squinting thinking, I don't know if either of these offenses in week one is going to be able to blow the doors off. And that matchup makes me feel like it's a lower scoring game. But new offensive coordinator for Notre Dame, new starting quarterback for Notre Dame, entirely new coaching staff, and 40% of the roster for Texas A&M, road game, Texas Heat, Kyle Allen Field. Like, all of that can throw variables into it where, I don't know, if you told me it was a shootout in August, like, what do I know? I think this is a really hard game to predict. But if you just take what we know on paper, makes me think it's going to be a defensive grind.
Totally agree. So I think you hit on it perfectly here, Brett. I think for Notre Dame, you're essentially looking at an inversion of yourself. It's our strengths or their weaknesses, and vice versa. So, but I think what you really have to focus on here is just the level of continuity. Texas A&M, not much continuity from the coaching staff to the transfer portal. Just a lot of change throughout the entire program. And I think that's going to be a net positive for them eventually. And I was hinting at this earlier in this episode. But I think in week one, that's going to be tough. Certainly, we have a lot of change as well with Denbrock. We have a new system. We have transfers coming in. But I think overall, our starting point is one that consists of much more stability than for Texas A&M. And of course, they have the tough road atmosphere. They have the heat. But I think in a big game like this, Marcus Freeman has shown that he has the team ready to go for big games. We've had letdown games before, but when there has really been a primetime game, the entire world is watching, we've generally shown up in those games. So I feel confident that that's going to happen here. I don't think the heat's going to bother us. I think that's just a storyline that that's fun to talk about if you're an SEC fan, if you're someone from the South. And also, this is a point we probably should have mentioned earlier. I mean, Notre Dame recruits nationally. So we do have plenty of players Riley Leonard's from Alabama. So we have plenty of players who are from the Deep South. This isn't going to be their first time playing in, really hot temperatures. So I think that for me, that gives Notre Dame the edge. I know SP Plus gives us the edge. If you look at the advanced metrics, SP Plus gives us the edge. Vegas says that we're 3-point dogs. I tend to agree with SP Plus. I think it's going to, like you said, I think it's going to be a defense. It's likely to be a defensive battle. The defenses are the strength of both these teams. So if I had a gun to my head, I have to pick a score. I think something along the lines of like a 17-13 Notre Dame is about what I'm feeling. It'd be hard for me to imagine either team putting up 30 points in this game. Just it doesn't feel like that type of game. But there are some other elements here that you hinted at. I think if I'm just looking at external factors that tend to lead to just very bizarre, weird games that just kind of could go anywhere. Just those games that you're watching at like 11 o'clock and it's like, oh my God, this game's still going. Like, how many points have they scored? I think a primetime game at Kyle Field, Texas A&M, first week of the season, really hot, bunch of change on both sides on both teams. that does feel like a recipe for a pretty wild game. So I would not be totally stunned if something like that happens. And we're saying it's low scoring. In a scenario like that, I wouldn't be stunned if it ends up being a wild shootout.
Absolutely. And, this game is a 46.5 over under. So Vegas thinks it's Texas A&M beating Notre Dame about 25-22. So certainly not a barn burner. Another thing too, I get that Texas A&M was a total disappointment a year ago. And I get it's an entirely different team now, but they lost to a ranked Oklahoma State team by 8, a ranked LSU team by 12, a ranked top 10 Ole Miss team by 3, a ranked top 20 Tennessee team by 7, and a ranked very good playoff caliber Alabama team by 6. So they hung in there. Like, no one really blew them out. And I bring that up because they still have talent. I know they lost a lot. I know Walter Nolan's gone. I know Evan Stewart's gone, but it's still a talented roster. And just like it's really hard to imagine Notre Dame getting blown out with our talent, I think it's really hard to imagine Texas A&M being blown out at their home field with their talent. So I also have this one low scoring, maybe not quite as low as you did. I wrote down Notre Dame wins this one 21-17. So I think we both think this is going to be a close, low scoring, could be just an ugly first game of the year, and you just got to go escape with the W. Really big game for Marcus Freeman. Really big road test. Get that monkey off your back. Go beat an SEC team. And a big opportunity for Notre Dame to come back with, we win this first game. I mean, driver's seat for the 5 seed in the college football playoff. We can maybe get back more into kind of how the playoff seeding is formatted and whether or not that's favorable or not for Notre Dame, but gunning for that first round home game in the driver's seat if we come out of College Station with a win. And if not, backs against the wall. You got to go run the table. But I think we're both feeling good going into this game. Slight road underdog, but we like the Irish in this one. And so we will be back with the recap after Labor Day. Until then, enjoy the kickoff to the college football season. Irish beat Aggies.
Irish beat Aggies.